Hello, and welcome to the second installment of Readings and Conversations with prize-winning writers from the Missouri Review. My name is Marc McKee, and I'm the managing editor of the Missouri Review. This project is supported by a generous grant from the Missouri Humanities Council through the National Endowment for the Humanities, and I want to be sure to express gratitude on behalf of the magazine and Missourians in general for that generosity. This is the second of three readings and conversations, which offers access to contemporary writers and their ideas about their work and their insights into their given genres, as well as prompts for writers and educators alike. I'm happy to be here today with Robin Reif. Reif's work has appeared in the New York Times, McSweeney's, a previous issue of the Missouri Review, and Off Assignment's Letter to a Stranger column, among other publications. She's working on a memoir and will receive an MFA from Bennington Writing Seminars in June 2023. She lives on Manhattan's Upper West Side. Of her prize-winning essay, Someone, editor-in-chief Spear Morgan describes it as a memoir of her relationship in her mid-20s with a New York professor and literary figure whose romantic attentions flatter her at first, but later, as the affair becomes more intense and teeters on the brink of marriage, Reif finds herself questioning whether she is losing herself in their volatile relationship. I would only add to that by saying that this essay is committed to expressing the truth about a younger self in ways that are unflinching and often unnerving. The clear, powerful prose manages to achieve a gravitas that is both wise and still seeking understanding, something that I think we are deeply thirsty for in our cultural moment of prevarication and the devaluation of truth. And now, without further ado, Robin Reif.
I am going to read an excerpt from Someone. And thank you so much, Marc, for that generous introduction. Someone. Midway through my precarious 20s, I met a man I'll call Hugh. Decades older, an accomplished academic and critic, he was a minor, though respected figure in New York literary circles. I first saw him in an empty classroom, looking out on soot-stained dorms, standing in the winter haze. He was tall and portly, his jacket doing a so-so job of elongating his thick middle. Though he was Sunday school scrubbed, fresh-shaved, neat, sandy hair, I guessed his age as mid-50s. An obvious wasp, he gave off the superiority of class. The man, I thought, in the slang of the day. He wore shiny wingtips, had a cigarette dangling between his freckled fingers. Despite the faint tremor in his hand, I could not see that he was a desperate smoker, nor could I read his fastidious hygiene as evidence of anxiety. He was teaching a course at NYU Medical School on Dr. Writers, Rabelais, Chekhov, Percy, and others. In the late 70s, teaching humanities in medical schools represented an effort to create well-rounded physicians, better, more empathetic observers and interpreters of human bodies and behaviors. The course was open to all grad students, and I was a part-timer in the School of Journalism, surviving on freelance writing jobs after ricocheting from acting to law school, to a year of pre-med for postgrads, and then switching to journalism. Now I was 26 and churning out breathless girl against the world features for Cosmo and Glamour. I anguished over leaving a possible medical career to spend my life writing trivia. The very idea of this seminar gave me hope. Perhaps I, too, could become a doctor writer, have serious, useful work experiences worth writing about, if only my stubborn heart would agree to beat a little faster at the thought. Early on, I believed that Hugh disliked me as much as I did him. His eyes seemed to tense each time I spoke, my words tumbling out passionate and unconsidered. By contrast, he spoke with formidable precision, in a standard American accent laced with an occasional lilt that hinted at time in the South. Everything about him signaled sobriety and gravitas. Mom's vision, he'd say, reflected the scientism that disfigured the fin de siècle. We once argued about the novel of human bondage. Philip, the hero, obsessively bound to Mildred, a waitress, finally tires of being played and abandoned, and so he resolves to marry Sally, with whom he'll live a life of dutiful convention. Hughes said that from an aesthetic perspective, this ending was inevitable. Confusing art and life, I countered, well, why would an artist and an orphan renounce a passionate attachment for a merely sensible match? This conversation would later haunt me. When class ended in May, I walked the harshly lit hall toward metal elevators and noticed Hugh calibrating his pace to stay abreast of me. Outside on Fifth Avenue, it was one of those spectacular New York days when the clear light shows you things you hadn't noticed before. I was heading home to my Brooklyn walk-up, Hugh to his village townhouse, and he offered me a lift downtown. I declined, saying I had no money to split the cab. Amused, he hailed one. When we got out at Washington Square, he walked me under the arch and into the park. Pausing near the fountain, he turned to look directly at me. Standing so close, I sensed his heft and solidity. I want to thank you for raising the level of discourse in this class, he said, taking my hand. His touch and words set off an alarming joy. When I left, everything in sight seemed intensely real. Drifts of daffodils, translucent grass, the dappled shade of maples, all sent my heart skyward. I had been noticed. I was someone. Perhaps the world had a place for me. In the place I still called home, or at least my permanent address, my parents trailed their grief from room to room. Their son had recently quit medical school to join a cult. 2 daughters had lost themselves and possibly their futures to drugs. Another daughter headed out late at night, seeking ice cream and Oreos, downing it all before puking it up. My failure to settle on a career made me, the default vessel of my parents' ambition, a colossal disappointment. That we had all once been bright and beautiful was a goading source of torment. That summer brought the surprise of Hugh's postcards from London, where he was teaching, each one written in a steady, unhesitating script, each letter on a parallel tilt, each word sitting neatly in its row. Stability, order, a paradise from which I felt excluded. In September, he returned. After he'd taken me to dinner several times, ambushed me with his stylish wit, after I'd wept on his fatherly bosom when my agoraphobic Finnish boyfriend left me, after I'd learned to my surprise that he was younger than my parents, only then did he risk linking his hand in mine one December night as we walked in the village. Any alert woman would have seen it coming. The woman I was felt blindsided. A few weeks later, he cooked dinner for me at his apartment. Duck, asparagus, and what he said was a very good Bordeaux, unaware that I would not drink it. Having seen one Stone's sister in the ER after cops peeled her off the sidewalk, and another skid down a flight of stairs while dazed on Quaaludes, I promised myself I'd stay sober. So Hugh managed much of the bottle himself while I downed apple juice from little boxes with straws he kept for his daughter's twice-a-week visits. There were drained glasses, empty juice boxes, and scraps of torn birds still on the table when he clumsily reached for my hand. When you look at me like that, he said, and lowered his eyes, it just excites me so. I can't speak. His forehead flushed. Having no experience of adult eroticism, my stomach clenched, and an arm shot out to drape his shoulder like a pal. What a funny pair we are, I said. Why, let's have dessert. Later, he said, drawing me to him. The pressure of his mouth aroused an upwelling of solace and desire, all but annulling my lost sisters and brother, the wounding parents, and my failure to solve their lives or my own. In the beginning, Hugh spoke of the likely brevity of our time together. I knew I was out of my depth, so at the time I felt relieved, but my feelings had no stability. Do you think we'll ever be legitimate? I asked one morning, some weeks later. We lay in the gray light of his bedroom after making love. What do you mean? Hugh was dauntingly precise and in his soft way demanded precision from me. Well, in your own words, you called this a problematic relationship, an anomaly. He rolled away and grabbed a cigarette from his nightstand. We could work it out, he said slowly. But of course, we have enormous differences. When you're in your prime, I'll be in my second childhood. He smiled at his little joke and lit up. No, he said, exhaling a soft cloud. Even if my insistence coincides with your acquiescence, even if we worked it out for a time, it wouldn't stay worked out. It would be unfair to you. He was now 45, in full maturity and beginning to feel the gravity of age. I was 27 and knew that time had me on a short leash as well. I wanted children. Hugh, recently divorced, already had a young daughter and wanted no more. He was the son of a fundamentalist preacher from rural Missouri. I was the daughter of an atheist Jewish doctor from Brooklyn. Hugh had struggled to escape the narrow religion of his father. I had begun to actively seek out the Judaism my parents had rejected. Despite Hugh's pronouncing the likely brevity of our time together, or perhaps because of it, I stayed for what I believed would be a brief interlude, for the frisson of transgression, the thrill of the great world Hugh opened, for the momentary shelter. There was something else I desperately needed and realized I could acquire from him. Call it education. I was young. I believed ideas were real. Hugh illuminated ideas that I'd sensed and hadn't truly thought until he spoke them into being. I'd equate freedom, he once said, with the absolute possession of one's own spirit, with psychological self-confidence and autonomous interior selfhood. At the time, everything he said seemed revelatory and new. He showed me that when you have words, you can make exquisite distinctions, more keenly perceive the subtle and fleeting. I'd fill my diary with things he said. Of my flirtation with Orthodox Judaism, he once pleaded, "Dear girl, don't be seduced like the old line Marxist who sacrificed subjectivity and the propriety of a private life to the abstractions of dialectical materialism." The man sang to me. And so I'd ask questions, seeking satisfying answers to queries that felt urgent, not yet knowing that they were breathtakingly naive. How can a great artist also be an anti-Semite? Do you believe grace is from God or just a neurological quirk? Of course, these masked questions far more interior and painful. How should I live? What should I believe? How do I save my family and survive them at the same time? One Sunday in our usual place, naked in his bed, we talked about the Iranian Revolution that was all over the news. Could he imagine, I asked, a cause for which he'd sacrifice his life? Well, he said, I've never been existentially tested. I've had my trials, of course, my divorces, but they've not been on a grand scale. Divorces? Plural? I'd been with you for 3 months, though managing to blind myself to just how ferociously attached to him I already was. I knew, of course, about his recent divorce, but not about a previous one. Her name was Alice, he said. We returned toward the window, spooning as he spoke. I looked out at the bloated sky overhanging Washington Square Park, its ghostly phosphorescence lighting the early magnolias, now relinquishing overripe petals that floated to the ground. They'd been married for 3 years when her father suddenly died, Alice became desperately depressed. She had to be hospitalized, and you cared for her 2 children from a prior marriage while teaching, paying medical bills, and visiting her daily. His savings ran out. He had to move her to a public institution. Each day, he said, it was a new nightmare, the crowding, the filth, all these ghouls wandering around. I began to see her as one of them. Once out, Alice, enraged at having been locked in the county hospital, sued for divorce. As Hugh was not the biological father, the children stayed with their mother, who moved to another state. Hugh rolled away onto his stomach, dropped his head into his hands. I can't make sense of it, he said. It was the most shattering experience of my life. As he spoke, the splintered landscape of his story invaded me. Only days before, I'd found my sister, now staying with me in my tiny studio. My parents had kicked her out. She was lying naked, passed out on the kitchen floor. The drug dealer to whom she owed money was buzzing from downstairs. I ran to check her pulse, then bolted the door, praying that no one would buzz him in while I hauled her body to the pull-out bed. The boundaries of normal in my life kept distending, so it didn't occur to me to tell anyone. Still, in taking in another human being's nightmare, I felt the reality of my own. In an instant, I slid my body under his, grabbing his head and pressing his mouth to mine until we both had to gasp for air. Frantic to get him inside me, I fumbled his cock. He grabbed my wrists and with surer aim plunged, nearly smacking my cervix as we fucked and cried and fucked again. It was dark when we finally got up to eat something. Afterward, he lit up, took a needy inhale, and said, how all this relates to you is that because of my disastrous marriages, it's not an option I want to pursue again. Since you want to be married, I appreciate that our relationship will likely be temporary. Thank you.
So, Robin, how do you see someone in relation to the genre of nonfiction? Are there precedents for you, historical or contemporary, for the way that you navigate the story you're trying to tell of your own life?
Great question. 2 parts, I think. The first was how I see my essay in relation to the genre of nonfiction. Well, I would say first that it falls into really a subset of nonfiction, specifically it's memoir. And, like nonfiction, of course, memoir is grounded in reality, but nonfiction encompasses, biography, investigative reporting, history, science writing, and memoir tends to be, be narrower in scope, but often deeper in ambition. And the ambition is really the ambition of an individual, a first-person narrator, to wrest emotional insight from critical moments, critical situations in her life that continue to haunt her, right? The obsessional relationship described in Someone has haunted me. And maybe to make this a little clearer than I just did, one of my absolute favorite memoirists, who is named Vivian Gornick, wrote a wonderful book called The Situation and the Story. And in this book, she says that the events that you recount, what happened, if you will, that's the plot, right? But the plot or what happened, that's merely the situation, and that's insufficient for memoir. Memoir needs the story, and what Gornick describes the story is the emotional experience and the insight derived from the situation that has preoccupied the narrator. So my narrator, stand-in for me, the author, is clearly obsessed with questions like, how did I get enmeshed in such a destructive relationship? Why was it so difficult to get free when theoretically I could have left at any time, and probably more at a bedrock level. How did this devastating experience contribute to the person I became? Which is a question I think that all memoirists ask at bottom. And it's really only in pressing myself, interrogating my memories, overcoming my shame, trusting my nose for truth, even when it felt scary, like doing it over and over, draft after draft. I mean, that's how I found the story, the heart of the essay. And to write that story, I used really two narrators. And I don't know if you can hear the two narrators at work as I was reading, but one is the narrator, the person or the persona I was then. That narrator recalls in high specificity the circumstances, details, all the dialogue. And I also use, though, a second narrator, the narrator of today, who has some perspective on why we wound up in that obsessional relationship. So you may recall sentences like, I could not see then that he was a desperate smoker. That's the narrator of today. Or any alert woman would have seen it coming. The woman I was felt blindsided. Those are, sort of examples of today's narrator. So I hope, Mark, that's clear, because I know you had a second question behind it.
Oh, I think that's absolutely clear. I think it's a fascinating insight into the nature of memoirs. You're using it to get to the bottom of your story.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, a very, very challenging process. I know you asked about, precedents, right, for the way I navigated this story.
Yes, you've mentioned Gornick, for example, as someone who gives you more insight into the genre, into the way that you're proceeding. Are there other writers, or are there other works of memoir that you've leaned on or been able to kind of access as a way for you to kind of to tell your singular story?
Absolutely. I would call out initially a piece that's not nonfiction or memoir, but it really probably is autofiction, and that's Marguerite Duras' The Lover. That was a book that helped me realize that I could write this, or that it was possible to write something like it. Some of it was the utter frankness with which she writes about sex, the way she conveys a really deep understanding that this is simply a physical act. It's simply behavior. It's an enactment of emotional dynamics between two people. And in that sense, it's not something prurient or, to write about. You're writing about the dynamics and the behavior. And also in her story, the way she treats power dynamics was very important to me, because her characters, as mine, have a vast age difference. And while it seems like a mismatch in power, given the older man, he's wealthier, he's more worldly, it turns out that the power of the younger woman is far more vast than she can understand or even handle. That's part of what oppresses her so much, is the stunning realization of her power, and how is she going to handle it? And finally, in Duras, at the end of this, doomed from the beginning affair, there's a real acknowledgement that it has everything to do with the woman she's become. I mean, it's a gorgeous piece of writing.
Well, thank you so much for that answer. I love it. And I think it's I think it sees far. And for anybody who hasn't read Duras, it seems like that's a great thing to do. Another part of what this project is about is to grant educators and writers with more ideas about how to further their own writing. And so I was wondering, for educators, writing teachers, or writers, what is a prompt that you might give them, either based on someone or a prompt that has worked to engage you and send you on a journey like this essay? And also, do you have a short list of recommended writers beyond Gornick and Dura, or stories who've helped you cultivate your sense of what you're trying to do when you're writing your memoir?
Absolutely. My all-time favorite prompt is derived from Off Assignment's Letter to a Stranger column. And an approximate way to state this prompt is to write about a complete stranger, right? Just a stranger who's intersected your life at some point and continues to haunt you. So I wrote 2 essays based on that prompt, one about a truck driver who picked me up when I was first hitching in Greece. And it was a pretty wild ride, but a very powerful experience. And and a woman who had died, and who ritually in Judaism, you wash the body in a ritual way and prepare it for burial. So those were 2 strangers that had an enormous impact on me. And in terms, and I think they're so fertile. If you go to Off Assignment and you look at that column, Letter to a Stranger, there's everything under the sun. You can see how broad it is and how fertile it is, for thinking. Who is that stranger? Why do they haunt you? Books, fiction and nonfiction, that have helped me cultivate, particularly, related to this essay, I would say, well, I mentioned The Lover and the Situation in the Story, Graham Greene's The End of an Affair, Vivian Gornick's actual memoir, Fierce Attachments, fabulous memoir, and Nicole Krauss's book of short stories, To Be a Man, were very influential, whether for style, for context, for characters, all fabulous to read. And I've been reading in the last year a number of memoir writers, many of whom have written multiple memoirs, and who I really admire and get a lot from, terms of inspiration and ideas. Melissa Febos is wonderful. Joanne Beard, phenomenal writer. Jeffrey Dyer, I like very much, the British writer. Charles D'Ambrosio, who wrote a superb book called Loitering. Peter Trachtenberg, who wrote Another Insane Desire. It's about cats. I could care less about cats, but this book is really a personal memoir and makes I wasn't bored for a second. It really makes you fascinated with humans and cats. Jenny Booley, a poet and memoirist. And I would also say, for balance, Alexander Heyman, let's see, I think he's Serbian. I hope, well, he's Sarajevan. He's fabulous. He's also a screenwriter.
Oh, thank you so much. That's a wealth there.
I read a lot. I read a lot.
Yeah. I failed to mention before that we're joined today by our marketing director, although that title hardly encompasses all that Kris does at the Missouri Review, Kris Somerville. Kris, do you have any questions?
Yeah, thanks, Marc. Like Vivian Gornick's, New York City is so central to your work. And the fact that Hugh lives in and around Washington Square couldn't be more perfect. It's such a literary and artistic landmark. So if you would say a little bit about the role maybe living in New York City plays in your memoir, in your writing, and in your life.
Well, New York City is home, right?
Right.
And that presents such a rich and fertile ground, tillable ground, even though you can't till anything in New York because everything's concrete, but pardon the metaphor, it still, works. Because everywhere you look is experience. Everywhere you look is something either shocking, which doesn't shock anymore, or interesting, or just the energy, right? I think that being a lifelong New Yorker probably creates a certain density that I have to work on in my prose because I do tend to pack a lot in, but it's our speed. We have this speed of speech and perception and richness of perception, so that it's harder to be utterly simple in our observations, or for me. So some of it is the pacing. Some of it is, this is the water I swim in. So it's just the love of the place. I mean, I talk about how the ugly, I would say they could win the Soviet Architecture Prize, the dorms that you see from the windows of NYU Medical Center. But to me, they're worth writing about and honoring. Or when it changes, the seasons change, and the clear light in New York, it's home,
When we were judging the contest, and I read this, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is a New York story. It's just, the place details are so wonderful. The other thing that struck me is this phrase, autonomous inner selfhood. And I think it's a phrase a lot of people would like to carry around with them. Say a little bit more about the meaning of that to you and to this piece.
I think, Kris, in picking out that phrase, you have isolated the phrase that ultimately defines someone, which was the achievement of the narrator ultimately, years after this ended. This narrator is deeply enmeshed in a very large family that at the time of this occurrence, they're just pinballing off one another. One's trouble creates the other's trouble, creates the grief of another, creates pressure on the fourth to help save everybody. It's just one big ball of enmeshment. And how do you become someone when there are all these bodies and ambient energies and dynamics that are so overpowering that it's very hard to understand your own desire and your own will? So that becomes the quest of this narrator. And it's also the answer to why she can't get free for all the years, 6 years that she's with this man, because she doesn't have it. She's kind of scaffolding herself on the self of an older, mature, good guy. But that's not the same as existing on your own, which is the task of every human being, is to become autonomous and part of the whole.
Yeah, the wisdom of this piece was just marvelous. And I'm looking forward to reading your memoir. So tell us where you are.
I'm on page 114.
Well, good.
To be exact. My strategy is to write it all the way through, probably to about 200 pages, and see what I've got. And then order and structure. I mean, I tend to draft perhaps even hundreds of times. I draft and draft and draft. Writing is rewriting for me. And I try really hard, and this is difficult to do because I don't tend to do it naturally. I try really hard to let the keys clack, to keep going, to really try to access the things I'm afraid to say, let the bad draft come out, because somewhere in there are all the things I'm embarrassed about, all the things that I feel shame, or that I feel sort of go over a line. And typically it's those moments, those elements of the story that stay and keep it strong. They become kind of the foundation of the story. And if you're editing yourself while you are writing, it's like, so that's why I keep drafting, if that makes sense.
It makes sense to me, and I think it's a wonderful response. And we're both eagerly awaiting that memoir.
Good.
What's the title, or the working title?
Working title: Jews Like Us.
It's
It
good.
might not be that title, but
Well,
it's a working title, because growing up in such a huge family, it was always us, right? Like, are they like us?
Right.
Jews?
so there's 2 sisters and a brother.
More. There's 3 sisters, a brother, dog, parents, bear,
It's a full house.
patients. My father was a doctor, so patients come into it. Kids we took in, because in those days, if a kid was sick, if the kid's family was sick and you had to remove the child from the family, guess where they came? To our house.
Wow.
To live with us.
I want to thank everybody for joining us, especially the Missouri Humanities Council for the generous grant, and more especially Robin Reif for being with us, reading her work and sharing her insights into writing and prompts thereof. Thanks also to Kris for her questions as well. And we'll see you next time.